It didn't arrive with a sudden jolt, neither as a clap of thunder nor as a flash of lightning. Its arrival was quiet, enveloping, like the very breath of the cosmos, which can't be perceived by the ear or the eye, but only through an inner sensation. Human civilization was accustomed to living with the conviction that the void above was chaos, but a predictable chaos, recorded in the ephemerides tables, charted on maps of planetary motion, and confined by the trajectories of comets and the orbits of satellites. But one day, the silence of space was broken not by a sound, but by a hint, by faint streaks of light that had permeated the cold detectors of a telescope. And for science, this was nothing unusual. Thousands of objects pass into the field of view of astronomers daily, each with its own story, each with its own orbit, obeying the old, familiar equations of Newton and Einstein. But this object was not one of them. Its trajectory produced strange oscillations in the hearts of those who first examined the data, for it did not belong to the solar system, nor did it fit into the system of habitual explanations. And it was as if the very darkness framing the planets and stars whispered, "This came from outside," thus giving rise to a silence, yet an unsettling silence, in which the question already echoed. Why now? Why here? The Earth rotated as it had for billions of years before, but during these weeks, the heavens seemed to decide to lift the veil and reveal a wanderer who had come neither by invitation nor by chance. No scientist would have called that moment an invasion. The word was too grand, too human, but everyone felt a hidden tension, as if the universe, indifferent to our worlds and our theories, had left a mark on the edge of the sky, a sign that could not be ignored. It all began with images, cold and digital, showing a point, simply a point against the background of infinite black depth. But within this point lay a drama compressed to the scale of a pixel. It carried within it something that changes history, something that overturns the conventional perception of the cosmos, not because the point was large, but because it had no right to be there. This silence preceding the revelation was reminiscent of mythical moments from ancient stories. When a hunter spots movement in the forest, when a sailor sees an unknown sail in the distance, when a person first realizes that a will might be hidden in the void. Scientific instruments don't transmit emotions, they record light, but the people looking into these instruments cannot help but feel the breath of the mystery. And then, in the laboratories, on the screens, in the night shifts of the astronomers, the feeling arose that the cosmos had taken a step toward them. It lacked clarity, it lacked form, but in this uncertainty, a plot was born that was about to unfold in full force. The object was designated 3I Atlas, but the dry name could not conceal that it held a story greater than a formula, more than a catalogue. Night after night, humanity gazed into this point, and it seemed as though the darkness itself was watching back. It all started with a routine observation, as is often the case in astronomy, not a spectacular discovery, not fanfare, but the quiet registration of light caught in the nets of telescopes, which, like fishermen on a boundless ocean, patiently wait for a catch. The Atlas Observatory in Hawaii was scanning the heavens in search of threats to Earth, asteroids that could one day change the planet's fate. Among the thousands of points moving on their habitual orbits, one stood out because of its behavior. It was moving too fast, too sharply, and at an angle that did not belong to the familiar dynamics of solar system bodies. Immediately, the data processing algorithms, accustomed to minor noise and glitches, flagged a warning. The object is anomalous, not a comet, not an asteroid, not space debris. It had no prehistory. Its trajectory could not be derived from long, billion-year journeys around the sun. It was entering the solar system as a guest whose invitation no one had sent. For astronomers, such findings had become part of a new era. The first was Oumuamua, the interstellar wanderer that entered the chronicles in 2017. Then came Comet Borisov, confirming that interstellar objects are indeed not an exception, but a regularity. And now, 3I Atlas, the third arrival, the third sign that the cosmos is not closed, that bridges between star systems exist, even if we do not build them. But 3I Atlas immediately behaved differently than expected. Its speed was anomalous, its entry angle sharp, and its trajectory seemed deliberate. When the data began to accumulate, the same silence that always precedes a discovery, a mixture of anticipation and dread, hung in the rooms of NASA. The trajectory indicated not merely an interstellar origin, It suggested the possibility of temporary capture into near-Earth space, as if someone or something had chosen not just to pass by, but to linger. This, precisely, became the sudden trace that left its mark not in the sky, but in the hearts of people. Because interstellar wanderers are supposed to fly past, disappear beyond the horizon, dissolve into the void. They are not supposed to stop. They are not supposed to enter an orbit around our planet. And while the data were being refined, while the spectrometers were being tuned to the new target, the first and most unsettling question arose. What if this trace is not a coincidence? What if the object is not merely a guest, but a messenger? And in this thought, like a shadow, the conjecture first sounded. Perhaps this is not a natural rock, but an artificial structure. The sudden trace, caught in the embrace of the Atlas telescope, had transformed into a symbol of a looming revelation, and where the certainty of the cosmos's indifference had once reigned, the first tremor arose. We may not be alone in the universe's field of view. The name always comes before the understanding. In astronomy, this rule has become a ritual. An object is recorded, receives a dry alphanumeric designation, and only then do people begin to assign it meaning. So it was here. 3I, Atlas, a short formula concealing an entire abyss. The letters and numbers spoke of its origin. 3, the third known interstellar wanderer, registered by humanity. Atlas, the name of the telescope system that first caught the reflection. But behind this dry code lay no history. Comets have tails, asteroids have an origin in the Kuiper belt or the main asteroid belt. They have a biography, albeit ancient, frozen in ice and stone. But 3I Atlas had no past. Its trajectory did not allow it to be linked to any particular star. It did not point to a specific place in the universe from which it might have arrived. It had wandered for too long, too chaotically, in the interstellar void, perhaps millions, or even billions of years, until it entered our field of view. And yet, there was something more in this nameless history, because, unlike cold stone slabs, 3I Atlas had peculiarities, as if it carried not merely the silence of the cosmos, but someone's intention. The scientists who received the initial data discussed them cautiously in closed meetings. The light spectra hinted at a strange surface composition. The object's reflectivity was changing too sharply, as if the surface was not homogeneous, but segmented, not random patches of minerals, but seemingly panels. Some data were reminiscent of observational artifacts, as if the telescope was seeing more than it should. Meanwhile, the press caught wind of the dry lines in astronomical bulletins. The name appeared in open databases, and the word interstellar once again stirred people's imagination. For a public that had barely become accustomed to the idea of Oumuamua, a third interstellar visitor became a symbol. The universe is not silent, it sends signs. But behind that name, a void still yawned. Where is it from? Why? How exactly did it end up in our system? Unlike planets and comets, where every crack on the surface holds a history, this object was mute, as if its past had been erased. A name without a past that is almost a challenge. It sounded like a riddle thrown to humanity, and the more frames with the small point appeared on the screens, the stronger the feeling grew. This is not just a random stone, it is a presence. It is a sign torn from the silence of space. And yet, while the world was learning to pronounce its name, 3I Atlas was already entering orbital calculations, and every new number in the equations only increased the tension. When the first orbital calculations confirmed that 3I Atlas would not just fly past, but was capable of lingering in the inner system, the feeling arose that is difficult to call scientific. It was closer to an ancient fear, when a person first hears steps in the dark. Scientists are accustomed to thinking in statistics, probability of collision, object mass, predictions of its path, but here, the mathematics began to yield something else. The trajectory of 3I Atlas hinted at the possibility of temporary Earth capture, not a collision, and that was important, but a presence nearby, almost an orbital dance. For an interstellar wanderer, this seemed improbable. Interstellar bodies should fly in straight lines, directly through the system, disappearing further into the darkness. They are too fast to linger. And suddenly, one of them seemingly slows down, as if examining the approaching planet. This was like a violation of all cosmic habits. Inside the closed halls of NASA and the European Space Agency, discussions became anxious. If the object is being captured into orbit, It means it is entering our zone of constant visibility. This transforms a chance discovery into a permanent presence. And a permanent presence is always a question. Astronomers recalled the case of Oumuamua. Its shape resembled an elongated cigar or even a flat disk. Its acceleration was not explained by gravity, and it was then that the hypothesis of a possible artificial origin first emerged. It was rejected by the majority, but left a trace. And now, with the third object, that trace was coming to life. Within science, there is always caution. Speculation is a dangerous tool. But when the data stubbornly form a picture that goes beyond the framework, panic becomes a natural, albeit hidden internal, reaction. But it is perceptible. Physicists try to find rational explanations. Interaction with the solar wind field, gravitational resonances, observational errors. But the more data came in, the clearer this non-error became. 3. Atlas was indeed behaving in a way that a space rock should not behave. And then, the first processed high-resolution photographs arrived, and on them were outlines that could not be described with a single word, neither a perfect sphere nor a chaotic rock. Something else was showing through in the object's shape, and it was at this moment that anxiety first escalated into the breath of panic. The panic wasn't in the shouts, but in the silence. People sat before the screens, knowing they were looking at more than just an interstellar wanderer. Something in the cold light of the images hinted. There might be a design here, and if the object has a design, it has a source. In the equations of orbits, there is no place for poetry. There are only numbers, angles, and velocities. And yet, it was the numbers that began to frighten. The trajectory of 3I Atlas was not merely interstellar, it was too regular and simultaneously too strange to be considered natural. At first, it seemed that the object obeyed the laws of celestial mechanics. It entered the solar system at a high speed, as an interstellar wanderer should. But then, near the Earth, the calculations began to produce oscillations, small ones, on the verge of acceptable error. But these distortions were repeating. They appeared precisely at moments when the object should have obeyed the gravitational laws in their purest form. Some of these deviations resembled a maneuver, as if 3I Atlas was slightly correcting its course, avoiding too close encounters with the Moon or Earth. And the longer the observation continued, the stronger the suspicion grew. Forces are at work here that do not fit into conventional scenarios. Celestial mechanics specialists offered explanations. Perhaps the object has an unusual shape, and the pressure of the solar wind acts on it like a sail. Perhaps the surface is releasing gases, like a comet, creating reactive acceleration. But none of these hypotheses explain the regularity of the trajectory changes. Natural forces are chaotic. They leave traces that can be recognized. Here, the movements were too precise. The models built by supercomputers showed 3I Atlas seemingly avoiding gravitational traps. Its path was not random, it seemed optimized. The word maneuver was voiced for the first time not by journalists, but in the working documents of astronomers. It was not spoken aloud in press releases, but it lived in the drafts of the calculations. The distorted trajectories were not just an anomaly, they hinted at a will. In mathematics, which had always been considered the mirror of an indifferent universe, the outline of an intention suddenly appeared. Against the backdrop of these discoveries, the question grew louder. If the object is capable of changing course, it is controllable. And if it is controllable, who or what is behind this control? In the night shifts of the observation centers, astronomers looked at their screens and felt only fatigue. They saw not just the curves of graphs, but a pulsing hint. Something in the sky is behaving as if it knows about our presence. And the longer 3I Atlas remained in the field of view, the stronger the feeling grew that it was not a random witness, but a participant. Its distorted trajectories were like a gesture of a hand, too subtle to be accidental and too distinct to be natural. When the giants got involved, telescopes with mirrors tens of meters across, orbital observatories, spacecraft with detectors, it became clear 3I Atlas did not wish to remain a nameless point. Its image began to emerge from grainy frames, like a developing photograph. At first, there were only contours, an indistinct geometry that could have been a rocky mass. But something in its outlines looked too rectilinear. Where comets are usually scarred by chaotic gas vents and ice, here the lines hinted at order. Light fell on the surface, reflecting as if it were hitting planes, not random protrusions. Reports cautiously used the words anomalous albedo variation. But for those who looked deeper, it seemed more like the object's surface was divided into segments, like panels. Sometimes it seemed they were catching light. Sometimes they were reflecting it in a narrow spectrum, as if they were controlled. Spectroscopic studies were also surprising. The chemical composition resembled a mixture of minerals and metals, but with impurities not typical of comet nuclei. In some measurements, peaks appeared that were more suitable for alloys than for natural rocks. Scientists argued instrument error or a new type of interstellar matter, but doubt grew. The spectral pattern seemed too artificial, and it was then that the metaphor first emerged. The object speaks not in words, but in light. Every telescope, from Chile to Hawaii, recorded the same phenomenon: strange pulsations of reflected light. They were not regular, like the signals of a radio beacon, but they were also not random. They could not be fully explained by rotation, as if 3I Atlas itself was whispering through its reflection, "I am here." For some, this was a challenge to the imagination. For others, a temptation to venture beyond the limits of science. But what else could be done if even the cold detectors were recording regularities that did not fit into familiar schemas? And the more images came in, the stronger the feeling became that the object was not merely being observed, it was responding. Its voice was quiet, like a hint, but it was this whisper of the telescopes that began to change perception. What was once a chance finding was turning into the story of a rendezvous, and in this story, equations no longer seemed like the only language. The object spoke with light, the astronomers with numbers, and a dialogue was born between them, in which no one yet knew who was asking the question and who was answering. When the first highly detailed images passed through processing filters, a new silence hung in the corridors of the research centers, not the silence of scientists engrossed in formulas, but the silence of engineers, accustomed to structures, to materials, to lines born not from the chaos of nature, but from blueprints. In the pictures of 3I, Atlas outlines appeared that were difficult to describe as anything other than structural. It seemed that the surface was not only segmented, but also joined by angles that were too regular for a random rock. In some places, parallels were discernible. In others, facets, like panels fitted together with precision. Engineers who worked with spacecraft recognized something more familiar in these lines: echoes of solar arrays, antenna sections, or radiator elements. Of course, no one could state this directly in scientific publications. It was not permissible to use the words craft, ship, or probe without irrefutable evidence. But in closed discussions, these were precisely the words that were heard more and more often. The incoming data on the object's albedo, the ability of its surface to reflect light, only reinforced the impression. Some sections reflected it too brightly, almost like metal. Others absorbed the rays, as if covered with a material close to composites. This did not look like the chaos of minerals. It looked like a mosaic of materials, chosen for different functions. And then, among the engineers, a feeling arose that was difficult to call rational. They were not seeing a rock, they were seeing a hint of someone's labor. As if someone, somewhere, sometime, had created a form that was now sailing through interstellar space and had arrived at Earth. In scientific reports, all of this was called observational artifacts, ambiguous data, or the need for additional analysis. But in the hallways of NASA, another idea was whispered: "It looks like a spacecraft." The whisper became a background hum, like a hidden current in the wires. No one was saying aloud that humanity was seeing an alien construction for the first time. But everyone felt that if these outlines were real, 3I Atlas was not just an interstellar wanderer, it was a witness to the existence of a will and a design alien, yet recognizable in its engineering logic. And the longer the engineers looked at the images, the stronger the strange feeling grew within them, as if someone from afar had set up a message for them, written not in words, but in the lines of a structure. With each passing day, the object 3I Atlas was more and more frequently compared to the other interstellar wanderer that had passed through our system just a few years earlier. Its name became a symbol of the enigma, Oumuamua, the first messenger from beyond the solar system, who left more questions than answers. Scientists remembered how it entered the chronicles: the elongated shape, like a cigar or a flat disc, the acceleration unexplained by gravity, the strange light reflections that suggested a metallic surface. At the time, many spoke of a possible artificial origin. The majority rejected these thoughts as too fantastic, but the hypothesis itself was forever left in the shadows. And now, 3I Atlas, the third interstellar object, but the first whose trajectory seemed to strive to linger near the Earth. Too many coincidences, too many hints that the story was repeating or continuing. Astronomers who had lived through the era of disputes surrounding Oumuamua looked at the new data with caution. They knew that any hint of something artificial instantly turns a scientific discovery into a sensation, but it was also impossible to ignore the obvious parallels. The phrase was often heard inside the research centers, "We are seeing the same thing, only more clearly." Where Oumuamua left grainy frames and circumstantial evidence, 3I Atlas showed more details. Its contours were sharper, its behavior even stranger, its reflections even more ambiguous, and so the memory of the first interstellar guest came alive in every discussion. Oumuamua seemed like a harbinger, its flight a prologue. And now, when a new object appeared in the heavens, people saw in it not just a wanderer, but a continuation of a story in which the first was merely a hint. For the public, this comparison became natural. Journalists wrote about a second, Oumuamua, but in the depths of scientific circles, a more troubling thought sounded. If the first was reconnaissance, what is the second? This parallel added weight, because one can be dismissed as a coincidence. Two is already a hint of a pattern. If the cosmos truly sends envoys, then 3I. Atlas is not just a memory of the past, it is a direct continuation in which humanity is called to play a new role. The more data that was collected on 3I Atlas, the louder the absence of something became. Radio telescopes around the world aimed their antennas at the object, hoping to catch even a hint of a signal. They expected random background noise, bursts of radio static, perhaps reflections from the solar wind, but the sky remained deaf. The radio noise of the cosmos is always full of crackling, always filled with the breath of distant quasars, storms on Jupiter, and the pulsations of pulsars. But nothing came from 3I Atlas. It reflected light, changed trajectory, and showed lines that resembled structure. But in the radio frequency, it was empty, perfect silence. For some, this became proof of natural origin. Artificial crafts should speak, transmit signals. For others, on the contrary, it was the most unsettling hint. If the object is artificial, its silence might be intentional. Perhaps it operates in modes inaccessible to our antennas. Perhaps its language is not radio waves at all. Astronomers also recorded spectra and infrared radiation, but even there, they found no unambiguous signs of activity. The object was seemingly hidden in shadow, as if it wanted to be seen with the eyes but not heard with the ears. This silence became a philosophical challenge. In antiquity, people looked at the stars and heard the will of the gods in them. In the 20th century, humanity began searching for signals, believing that any civilization should want to be heard. But now, an object had appeared in the heavens that was not speaking. Its presence was more eloquent than any speech, and its silence heavier than any sermon. The paradox was debated in scientific circles. If it is a probe, it is behaving as if it is concealing its mission. If it is a rock, it resembles a spacecraft too much. In any case, the silence brought no relief. It left room for conjecture, and conjectures are often more frightening than any answers. Journalists waited for sensations, the public for revelations, but scientists knew that the void in the data can be far more eloquent, because in the silence of the heavens, sometimes what is hidden is not indifference, but waiting. And then a new question arose that did not leave the astronomers during the night hours of observation. What if the object hears us but simply does not respond? While caution reigned in scientific publications, the corridors of the research centers filled with whispers. In official reports, 3I Atlas was still called an unusual interstellar object. Its albedo, trajectory, and possible composition were discussed. But behind closed doors, the conversation was already different. Engineers shared frames in which two straight edges were discernible. Astronomers forwarded to each other spectra, suspiciously resembling metallic peaks. Radio telescope personnel spoke of strange gaps in the data, as if something was blocking the usual cosmic noise. No one claimed out loud that it was a ship or a probe, but everyone knew. Such coincidences do not let one sleep soundly. It was then that the phrase Atlas probe appeared in the hallways of NASA, unofficial, playful, but persistent. It circulated in conversations, as if someone had already subconsciously accepted that this might be a craft. And even though official science kept its distance from loud declarations, the researchers themselves felt they were on the verge of a revelation for which they were not prepared. During these weeks, leaks intensified. Journalists began publishing fragments of internal correspondence that included phrases like artificial structure, possible maneuver, and anomalous reflections. Of course, in the press, this instantly turned into a sensation. NASA is hiding evidence of an alien probe. Agency management refuted everything, but the denials only fueled the suspicion. And in the quiet of the laboratories, employees discussed not only the object's physics, but the consequences. What would happen if it were acknowledged not to be a rock? How would science change? How would politics change? Is humanity ready for the thought that something created by non-humans is circling nearby? And in these conversations, the fear sounded not of a collision the trajectories showed there was no threat, but of the thought itself. The cosmos is no longer empty. It can look at us, and perhaps it is doing so right now. The rumors in the corridors of NASA became a new shadow that grew faster than the data. After all, sometimes the greatest mystery is not what the telescopes see, but what those who look through them are afraid to say aloud. Numbers rarely lie. They can be misinterpreted, simplified, or overloaded. But if the data converge, mathematics becomes a merciless mirror. It was this mirror that showed 3I Atlas is not behaving as a rock, even an interstellar one should. Orbital calculations were based on thousands of observations. Each measurement refined the trajectory, adding new points to the curve that was supposed to form the basis of predictions. But the more data were entered into the model, the more it fanned out. The lines of motion diverged, as if someone was intervening, changing the equation right in the process. Gravity's law is strict. It leaves no room for whims. Everybody, be it a dust particle or a comet, is obliged to submit to its dictates. But 3I Atlas repeatedly displayed deviations, so small that they could be called within the margin of error, but too regular to be random. Teams of mathematicians tried to explain this with features of the shape, suggesting that the pressure of the solar wind acts on the object like a sail, creating acceleration. But then the trajectory should deviate chaotically, depending on rotation and surface area. Here, the changes resembled a calculation. They looked as if the body was choosing an optimal path. The most frightening conclusion was that the models showed that near the Earth, the object corrected its course so as not to enter the direct collision zone, and it did so with an accuracy of up to a few kilometers, a result unattainable for a random gas emission or solar pressure. These conclusions were not published in open journals. It would have been too audacious to claim deliberate movement. But within the research groups, the phrase that gave no peace was heard. Behavior that does not correspond to the laws of gravity. The mathematics of the anomaly turned into a kind of cryptogram. Every new equation became a symbol of the mystery, and every check only confirmed the strangeness. In this dry symphony of numbers, a motif was born that could only be heard with the heart. The object seemed to be playing with the laws we considered absolute. And then the main question arose. If mathematics records an intention, who is behind that intention? When it became clear that the trajectory of 3I Atlas was not only anomalous but dangerously close to the Earth's stable capture zone, a different kind of anxiety began in the research centers. Not the fear of a collision, the calculations showed the object would not crash onto the planet's surface, but the anxiety of presence. Usually, interstellar wanderers sweep past, like comets, like an arrow piercing the solar system. Their path is fast, their story is short. But 3I Atlas, on the contrary, seemed to be seeking a place near the Earth. Its deceleration near the planet looked as if it had allowed gravity to catch it. This meant that humanity was encountering an interstellar body for the first time that would not disappear beyond the horizon in weeks or months. It could remain here for years. For military analysts, this became a reason for the most grim scenario. An object capable of maintaining near-Earth orbit is an observer, and an observer always brings the question, what is it studying, and to whom is it transmitting the data? Politicians demanded risk reports from NASA, and diplomats discussed the possibility of covert interference by other nations, perhaps a secret satellite disguised as an asteroid. But physicists shrugged. The object is too large, too distant, and too anomalous to be explained by human technology. The public knew only fragments, dry press releases and articles about the third interstellar object. But in closed reports for the governments of the United States and Europe, the phrase that no one wanted to say publicly sounded possible artificial origin. This cautious wording created an anxiety stronger than any revelation. Because if the object was indeed created, it was created by someone who has surpassed us in the understanding of stellar distances. And it is here now, nearby, close to the blue planet, that still believes in its own loneliness. Orbital anxiety became a new reality. It spread through the corridors of observatories and control centers, through the offices of officials, and through the dark halls where military personnel watched the telemetry screens. Humanity felt for the first time that it was not the observer of the cosmos, but the object of observation. And this realization proved heavier than any risk of collision. It soon became clear that the issue was not just anomalies in the equations. Observations conducted on different continents and from various orbital platforms pointed to the same thing. 3. Atlas was altering its motion as if guided by invisible hands. These corrections were not abrupt. There were no gas flares, as with comets. There were no ejections that could be recorded by spectrometers. The object was moving smoothly, as if someone was gently nudging it in the right direction. And yet, the trajectory changes coincided with the mathematical models of an ideal maneuver that engineers use when calculating satellite paths. Astronomers expected chaos, but instead, they saw logic. The deviations from gravitational calculations added up to lines in which a strategy was discernible, avoiding too close encounters, remaining in the shadow of the Earth and the Moon, and choosing positions where telescopes would record the minimum of details. This resembled a cautious presence, as if the object consciously did not wish to show everything it was capable of. It was then that a new phrase appeared in the reports: unexplained navigational activity. This was an attempt to conceal the essence behind words, but among engineers, no one took it literally. Everyone understood that the discussion was about maneuvers, and a maneuver is always a sign of control. The question of what exactly was controlling the object remained open. Perhaps it used forces unknown to us. Perhaps its engines were technologies inaccessible to our understanding. Or perhaps it simply reflected and used space itself, bending it like fabric. But the most unsettling question was not how, but why. Every maneuver seemed meaningful. It did not lead to a close approach with Earth. It did not demonstrate aggression, but it was also not chaotic, as with natural bodies. These were the movements of an observer, not a wanderer. And then, within scientific circles, the conjecture grew louder. 3. Atlas is not just an arrival from the interstellar depths, it is a craft executing a task. And its invisible hands are a hint of the presence of an intelligence capable of moving where we are only just learning to take our first steps. The data accumulated like heavy raindrops before a storm. Every new image, every spectral line, every trajectory curve only intensified the tension. A silence reigned in the laboratories and data processing centers, in which waiting became almost physical. Everyone understood that at some point, the truth would be revealed, and it would no longer allow one to look away. Scientists checked the data again and again. Algorithms processed arrays of information, searching for natural explanations, gas emission, solar pressure, or optical artifacts. But increasingly, the results pointed to one conclusion: it is impossible to explain the object's behavior by conventional means. Then, there was only waiting. Waiting for the object to reveal its secret itself. Waiting meant gazing intently at every light fluctuation. Sometimes, patterns of reflection, resembling pulsations, appeared on the surface of 3I Atlas. They emerged and disappeared, like a breath. Some researchers proposed interpreting them as signals. Others considered them a trick of the light. But the fact remained, they repeated too orderly to be noise. And in this waiting for the revelation, a new layer of emotion emerged. It was not just curiosity, it was anxiety about what might lie beyond the habitual. What if the object is truly artificial? What if it is a probe, an observer, a witness to another civilization? How will our self-perception change? The public knew only echoes. Sensational headlines flashed in newspapers and on websites, but they drowned in the usual noise of news. Only a few understood that at that very minute, humanity stood on the threshold of one of the most significant discoveries in its history. And inside the research groups, every new frame was examined as if it could be the decisive one. Every night, a breakthrough was awaited. Every night, there was hope that 3I Atlas would reveal itself as more than a point of light. And in this silence of expectation, a strange feeling was hidden, as if the object itself was choosing when and what to show, as if it knew it was being watched. as if it understood that the revelation had to happen at its own time. When telescopes began recording light variations with extreme precision, something emerged on the surface of 3I Atlas that astronomers called photonic scars. These were regular fluctuations in brightness that arose during the object's rotation, but they were not like the usual reflections from the chaotic forms of asteroids or comets. Typically, such light curves are explained by irregularities, protrusions, craters, and areas with different reflectivity. But here, everything looked different. The peaks and troughs followed a rhythm that seemed too ordered, as if the object's surface bore not the chaos of geological processes, but a pattern that repeated, as if applied intentionally. Some researchers compared these variations to a modulated signal. The light reflected from panels or facets converged into patterns that resembled not a random occurrence, but a sequence. They could not be deciphered in the conventional sense. They were not radio signals, nor a code in the binary system, but they looked as if the object's surface itself was a carrier of information. It was then that the metaphor scars in the light was born, because the patterns looked not like decorations, but like traces, like a memory of something the object carried within itself. Perhaps they were the marks of its creators? Perhaps they were the result of a long journey through interstellar space? Or perhaps they were a way to speak with those who were able to listen, not with their ears, but with their eyes. Skeptics argued that everything was explained by a complex geometry, that the rhythm was an illusion born in the human brain, which yearns to see regularities. But the more data came in, the harder it was to reject. The variations were repeating, they were stable, as if a beacon were built into the object, operating not on radio waves, but on light reflections. And in this silent glow, humanity first felt a strange sensation. Perhaps the object is not just reflecting the sun's light. Perhaps it is leaving a message. Not a message in words, but in photonic scars, in a whisper of light that one must know how to hear. For astronomers, this became a new stage of observation. For philosophers, a new stage of waiting. Because if 3I Atlas carries signs, it is not only present, it is speaking, but speaking in a language we have not yet learned to understand. When the photonic scars and distorted trajectories became too obvious to be ignored, cautious hypotheses began to appear in scientific circles. They were not printed in official journals, but they circulated in the hallways of conferences, passing from mouth to mouth in whispers. What if this is indeed a probe? The idea of interstellar automata wandering in space was not new. It had been proposed back in the 20th century, the so-called von Neumann probes, devices capable of self-replication and endless travel. In theory, such devices could fill the entire galaxy, exploring world after world, but it was just mathematics, a game of imagination. No one expected that humanity would one day see them in reality. 3I Atlas looked as if it was confirming the impossible. Its movement resembled cautious navigation, its surface an artificial structure, and its light variations a ciphered language. All of this converged into the image of a machine that came not for contact, but for observation. But if it is truly a probe, the question arises, whose creation is it? Does it belong to a civilization that exists even now? Or is it a relic of an ancient culture that faded millions of years ago? Perhaps it was flying through the galaxy without masters, like a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean. Some scientists advanced the hypothesis that such probes might be ubiquitous, that the galaxy is a library where every star holds silent observers in its vicinity. We are simply too young to notice them, and only now, with the development of telescopes, are we beginning to see what has always been nearby. Others insisted that if it is a craft, it is active, and then its mission is the observation of Earth, not invasion, not contact, but precisely observation. The question why remained unanswered. Perhaps it is research, perhaps it is an examination, perhaps it is a warning. Theories multiplied like stars in the night sky, and each of them left an unsettling trace. If this is indeed a probe, we are encountering for the first time not a silent cosmos, but someone's hand reaching across light years. And now, it was up to humanity to decide which was scarier, to accept it or to continue pretending that it was just a rock. The scientific community found itself in a trap. All known laws of nature demanded rational explanations, but every new observation of 3I Atlas seemed to be a challenge to physics itself. First, its trajectory. The laws of celestial mechanics are strict and transparent, but the object seemed not to obey them completely. The maneuvers recorded by telescopes left no traces of reactive ejections. Therefore, no conventional thrust could explain its behavior. It looked as if it was moving without engines. Second, its light variations. If it were a rock or an icy core, the reflections should have been chaotic, related to rotation. But instead of chaos, rhythm appeared, almost a harmony, as if the surface were constructed to communicate with the Sunday third, its stability. Interstellar objects usually bear traces of destruction, cracks, fractures, and sublimation. But 3I Atlas looked whole, as if it had passed through millions of years of interstellar storms unscathed. For a natural body, this is almost an impossibility. For an artificial one, it is a regularity. And it was then that physicists began cautiously discussing the impossible options. What if we are encountering a technology that uses the forces of space directly? What if it levitates by catching the quantum fluctuations of the vacuum? What if it controls gravity, bending it on a local scale? These ideas sounded like science fiction, but the data itself pushed towards the fantastic. There were too many hints of logic in them, too little chaos. For philosophers, this became a reminder. Our laws of nature are only an attempt to describe the world, but not the world itself. Perhaps somewhere, a civilization exists that has taken the next step, learned to control what seems impossible to us. And in this context, 3I Atlas looked not like a threat, but like a mirror. It showed us the boundaries of our understanding. It said, "You think you know the laws, but they are wider than your equations." The physics of the impossible was ceasing to be a theory. It was manifesting right in the sky above Earth, in an object that should not have existed. And it was this feeling that was turning consciousness upside down. The universe is greater than our formulas, and Atlas became its living proof. When the quality of the images reached the limits of the capabilities of ground-based telescopes and spacecraft, forms appeared in the pictures of 3I Atlas that were impossible to attribute to the chaos of nature. Where the disorder of craters and cracks always reigns on asteroids, here, lines emerged that hinted at a design. Some parts of the object looked like planes, joined at a right angle. Others looked like curved segments, as if made of a material calculated for a load. In places where chaotic reflections were expected, smooth areas appeared, like panels laid side by side. Engineers analyzing the images cautiously used the term structural symmetry. They couldn't call it a ship or a station, but they admitted the forms do not resemble random ones. In the shadows, contours similar to ribs of stiffness or a frame were discernible. Even the distribution of glints looked as if they were coming from surfaces created for a specific function. A comparison emerged within the research teams. The object resembled a satellite, but a satellite built on the scale of kilometers, a colossal structure capable of withstanding millions of years of interstellar travel. Philosophers saw something more in this. They said that before us was not just a body, but a text. The architecture of the object is its language. Its lines are the letters. Its symmetry is a phrase addressed to those who know how to read in space. But along with the admiration, anxiety grew, because the hidden architecture hinted, if this is indeed a created thing, its creators possessed knowledge and technology far surpassing human capabilities. To build not for decades, but for eternity. To create not for one system, but for the galaxy. And in this silent silhouette, a new feeling arose. 3I Atlas was not just a mass wandering in the darkness. It was a structure, a testament to the fact that there are hands in the universe that know how to shape matter so that it outlives stars and distances. The hidden architecture became its signature, not a slogan or a signal, but a form that in itself meant, we were here, we are watching, we build where you are only beginning to dream. Despite the increasing amount of data, despite the hints of structure and behavior, the universe stubbornly did not reply. 3I Atlas circled on its strange trajectory, as if in indecision, and yet emitted not a single signal that could be deciphered. Radio antennas were silent. Spectra remained enigmatic, but gave no clue to intentions. This silence was heavy. People had always imagined contact with an alien intelligence as a dialogue, as a meeting of two voices. But here, near the Earth, silence reigned, as if someone had deliberately left the object to speak only with form, but not with sound. Some scientists argued that this was the true language, that silence was a way not to interfere, that the very fact of the object's presence near Earth was already a message understandable without words. We can come here, we can be nearby, we observe. Others considered the silence the most unsettling sign, because silence can mean both indifference and superiority. One who is silent may be so far removed from us that they do not see fit to engage in contact. Or, even more frighteningly, they are studying, but not revealing their intentions. Philosophers recall the Fermi paradox. If the galaxy is full of civilizations, why don't we see them? Perhaps the answer is simple. They are here, but they choose to be silent. 3. Atlas was becoming a confirmation of this hypothesis. There is a gaze, but no words. And in this silence, humanity seemed to begin to hear itself louder. Newspapers debated, people shared theories, politicians sought threats, and poets wrote verses about the silent wanderer. The object said nothing, but its presence forced billions of people to speak. The silence of the universe proved more eloquent than any signal. It transformed into a mirror in which humanity saw its own fear and hope. We looked at 3I, Atlas, and understood it might be a probe, it might be a rock, it might be a monument to a perished civilization, but regardless of the answer, the silence remained the heaviest element. It was this silence that became the essence of the mystery. It carried within it not an absence, but an intention we could not yet read. At some point, the discussions surrounding 3I Atlas ceased to be solely the concern of physicists and engineers. Philosophers, cultural experts, and poets joined the conversation. They saw in the silent wanderer not just a scientific phenomenon, but an archetype, a sign that humanity had awaited for centuries. The object began to be compared to messengers from myths, to angels who come not for dialogue, but simply to be present, to ancient idols that are silent, but whose silence compels people to seek answers within themselves. 3I Atlas is a letter from the future, they said, a letter written not in words, but by its presence. Some thinkers suggested that the very fact of its arrival was a message to descendants who have yet to grow to the level of understanding, as if the object arrived too early, and we are not yet able to decipher its essence. It might be part of a chain, long and stretched out, like the history of the stars itself, links of messages sent by civilizations to one another across light centuries. To scientists, such ideas sounded too poetic, but even they understood. Beyond the strict equations, always stands the question of meaning. If the object is artificial, its purpose might not only be technical, it could be a symbol. Perhaps its function is merely to be noticed, to become a mirror for those who gaze into it. And for humanity, this letter from the future had already worked. It became a reason for reassessment. Who are we in the galaxy? What does it mean to be noticed? Are we ready for a dialogue if it ever takes place? In antiquity, messages came on clay tablets, in scrolls, in books. Now, perhaps, humanity has received a message written by the very matter of the cosmos. A massive object hovering nearby became a symbol of a future into which we accidentally peeked, like a child who opens a door and sees a room intended for adults. 3I Atlas said nothing, but in its silence, people heard a premonition, and everyone understood it in their own way. Someone saw a threat, someone hope, someone a reminder that the universe is always one step ahead. To unravel the nature of 3I Atlas, humanity threw all its tools into the fight. Ground-based telescopes on the peaks of Chile and Hawaii, radio telescopes sensitive to distant quasars, orbital observatories like Hubble and James Webb, all were aimed at a single target. Never before had so many human eyes looked at one point simultaneously. Each instrument revealed a new layer. Optical telescopes provided shapes and reflections. Radio antennas recorded the absence of habitual noise. Infrared sensors showed the thermal profile, which was also strange. 3I Atlas did not radiate heat as a rock or icy body should. Its surface seemed insulated, as if created to minimize losses. Synthetic aperture systems played a special role. Several telescopes were combined into a single network, creating an image with incredible resolution. And then, the object's contours emerged even more clearly: angles, lines, and surfaces. All of this hinted at architecture, not the chaos of nature. But the main feature of the observations was that the object seemed to react to the attention. In moments when telescopes switched to maximum amplification, the light variations of 3I Atlas became more distinct. Some interpreted this as an illusion, the effect of big data. Others saw in it a hint of feedback, as if it sensed that it was being watched. For the first time in history, All major observatories in the world worked synchronously for a single object. Nights and days merged into a single shift, where scientists from different countries exchanged raw data almost in real time. Borders and politics disappeared in the face of the mystery. People became a single community, and in these endless streams of data, the feeling arose. 3. Atlas was not just an object of observation, it was turning the observers into participants itself. Its presence became a test not only for technology, but for science itself, a test of resilience, of the ability not to look away from the impossible. Every new image was a step forward, but also a step deeper into the unknown. And everyone understood. Instruments can show lines and spectra, but they cannot answer the main question. Who created this strange object hanging near Earth, and why? When the first processed data on 3I, Atlas leaked into open databases, not only professional astronomers, but also thousands of amateurs joined the mystery. The internet turned into a gigantic laboratory. Every light curve, every long exposure image was scrutinized in different countries, compared, filtered, and checked for regularities. It was then that unexpected confirmations began to appear. Amateur telescopes, much more modest in capabilities, recorded the same strange features as the giants. Observers from South America and Eastern Europe independently registered the light variations, the very photonic scars that seemed too rhythmic for a rock. Comparative curves uploaded to open archives coincided almost perfectly. Internet forums filled with graphs, screenshots, and homemade models. Skeptics claimed that people were seeing what they wanted to see, projecting fears and dreams onto an ordinary asteroid. But the coincidence from different points on the planet was difficult to explain as a hallucination. Some amateurs went further. Using archival data from past years, they checked whether the object had previously passed through the telescope's field of view, simply remaining unnoticed. And in old images, they indeed found faint hints, tiny points that could now be correlated with the trajectory of 3I Atlas. This meant it had been present longer than believed. It was just that humanity had not looked closely enough before. The open archives became a mirror in which the mystery only intensified. Every new participant, every new diagram added confirmation. The object is not chaotic. Its trajectory is too neat, its reflections too regular. And in this common movement, something important was revealed. The mystery no longer belonged only to NASA or the ESA. It became the property of humanity. Anyone with a telescope and internet access could become a witness. For many, this turned into a personal experience. For the first time in history, everyone could feel that they were looking at the sky and seeing not just distant light, but something that could change the perception of humanity's place in the universe. And in this democratic unveiling, a new dimension of the enigma was hidden. 3. Atlas was not only an object of science, it became an object of universal gaze. And the more people looked, the stronger the thought grew. It is truly here. When calculations confirmed that 3I Atlas was approaching Earth and its orbit would cross the inner boundaries of the system, anxiety ceased to be solely the concern of scientific circles. Governments began asking direct questions. If the object is capable of maneuvering, if it maintains proximity to the planet, does it pose a threat? Military analysts considered the worst scenarios. Even if the object's mass was relatively small by cosmic standards, its fall to Earth would be a catastrophe. But the possibility that the object was not a rock at all was far more frightening. If it was a structure, it might contain technologies or mechanisms unknown to us. And the unknown always inspires more fear than a visible threat. Astronomers tried to reassure, according to all trajectory models, there will be no collision. But their words did not relieve the tension, because a passing asteroid is one thing, and an object that seems to be choosing its position is another. The public learned about the approach through leaks. Newspapers wrote about potential danger. Bloggers constructed invasion scenarios, and television channels broadcast programs with sensational headlines. And the more NASA and the ESA were silent, the more the rumors grew. Meanwhile, scientists continued to record strange details. The photonic scars were becoming brighter, as if the object was reacting to the increase in attention. Its maneuvers increasingly seemed less random. Some specialists seriously discussed the idea. Perhaps it is demonstrating its presence, not hiding it. And this was the most unsettling thought. After all, to show oneself is to acknowledge contact. yet the silence remained absolute. It was as if 3i Atlas wanted to be noticed, but did not want to be understood. Tension grew in this duality. For scientists, it was a challenge. For philosophers, a sign. For politicians, a threat. But for humanity as a whole, it became a new type of anxiety. Fear not of a catastrophe, but of a gaze directed from outside. The growing anxiety covered all levels of society. People looked at the sky and knew that there, in the planet's shadow, something was circling whose origin could not be explained. And even if it was silent, its presence alone was changing the worldview. Everyone understood that the decisive moment would be the passage of 3i Atlas through perigee, the closest point to Earth. It was then that telescopes would achieve the highest resolution. Satellites, the clearest data, and humanity a chance to see the object for what it was. But along with the hope for revelation, fear grew. Because perigee was not only a moment of clarity, but also a moment of choice. The closer D-Day approached, the more intense the discussions became. Some said, "This is our chance. We must direct everything we have to examine the object down to the smallest detail." Others warned, "What if it responds? What if it shows activity precisely when it is closest?" Night meetings were held in scientific centers. Observation plans were drawn up, which wavelengths to use, which instruments to synchronize, and which algorithms would analyze the data in real time. It was like preparing for a mission, but a mission without a launch, because the target had come to us. For the public, the wait became almost mystical. The media discussed dates and constructed theories. Someone expected a signal, someone a catastrophe, someone a miracle. Ancient prophecies and myths, which were now associated with the appearance of the interstellar wanderer, resurfaced in the cultures of different countries. But for the scientists themselves, perigee was not a myth but the limit of patience. Everyone knew, if the object was truly artificial, if there was a mystery in it, it should be revealed at that very moment. Even if 3i Atlas remained silent, its form, its structure, and its light would provide answers. And at the same time, no one could shake the feeling that the object itself also knew about this moment. Its trajectory seemed too perfectly calculated to be just a coincidence, as if it had chosen the time and place of the rendezvous itself. The question of time became not just technical, it turned into a symbol. Humanity found itself in the role of a witness who was about to hear a revelation, but only at a specific moment. And the closer this moment approached, the stronger the feeling the countdown has begun. When the date of the perigee passage became known to the general public, a wave of speculation swept the world. The internet became an arena where versions clashed. Some claimed that 3i Atlas was an ancient artifact left by a civilization that observed Earth before the emergence of humans. Others insisted it was a secret project of a superpower, disguised as an interstellar object to test the public reaction. Schemes, blueprints, and leaked documents bearing the seals of NASA and the Pentagon appeared online. Some spoke of supposedly hidden radio signals. Others claimed the object carried a weapon. Still others believed it contained a message encoded in its light variations. Television talk shows discussed the versions with serious faces, inviting military personnel, psychologists, and astrologers. Politicians were forced to give reassuring speeches, but every refutation only fueled new rumors. The more NASA was silent, the louder the conspiracy theories became. The idea that 3i Atlas was linked to Oumuamua became particularly popular, that the first object was a scout, and the second was an observer, and that new, more explicit crafts would follow them. This version became almost a myth, in which people saw a premonition of imminent contact or imminent catastrophe. Some conspiracy theorists claimed that governments already knew the truth and were preparing for a global event, concealing it from the public. And it was because of this, they said, that data on the object were published slowly and key observations remained secret. For scientists, all of this was noise, hindering quiet work. But even they understood, the silence of official sources is the soil in which myths grow. And in these myths, there was an echo of truth, because there might not have been a conspiracy. But there was an object, silent and mysterious, and that in itself seemed far more frightening than any theory. And yet, it was thanks to the conspiracy theories that humanity first began to talk about 3i Atlas as a planetary scale event. From a myth, it was turning into a symbol, and everyone saw in it what they feared or expected the most. A schism began within the academic world that became inevitable over time. One group of scientists insisted on strictly following the data and urged avoiding any talk of probes or artificial origin. They argued science must remain cold, even if the facts seem challenging. For them, 3I Atlas remained an unusual but natural object, and any speculation only undermined trust in science. But the other group, a minority, but increasingly vocal, argued the opposite. They believed that precisely honest analysis must allow for every possibility, even the most incredible. After all, if observations do not fit into familiar models, one cannot continue to insist on old explanations. For these researchers, 3I Atlas was becoming possible evidence that humanity was no longer alone. This dispute flared up in the hallways of conferences, at closed seminars, and in correspondence between institutions. Some accused colleagues of pseudo-scientific fantasies. Others, in turn, spoke of the fear of acknowledging the obvious. Sometimes, it seemed as if the object itself was observing not only the Earth, but also the arguing minds, checking whether humanity was ready for a step beyond the habitual. Young researchers were drawn to the bold hypotheses. For them, 3I Atlas was a chance to break the mold. Older professors held on to caution, fearing that science would lose its reputation. Working groups with diametrically opposite approaches emerged in universities and institutions. This internal rupture turned out to be philosophical. Science has always been a balance between curiosity and skepticism, but here, the stakes were different. If the object is artificial, it is a discovery comparable to the first time ancient humans saw fire. If not, it is just another rock, but a rock that taught us to look more closely. And everyone understood. History would remember not only the object itself, but also how science reacted to it. It would remember who dared to speak the truth and who chose silence. In this duality, science reflected all of humanity, the willingness to dream and the fear of acknowledgement. And 3I Atlas seemed to become a catalyst, sharpening this choice to the extreme. When 3I Atlas approached Earth close enough for telescopes to distinguish details, the human gaze first encountered its own limit. The data were becoming clearer, but instead of clarifying the mystery, they made it deeper. High-resolution images showed surfaces that could no longer be explained by chaotic formations. Smooth planes, angles, and lines, all of this emerged too distinctly. But at the same time, the images contained noise, distorted fragments, as if the object itself was hindering being seen. Some frames came out almost crystal clear, others were distorted, as if 3I Atlas reflected not only light, but also the very attempt to observe. Infrared data added new questions. The object's thermal profile remained abnormally stable, as if the surface possessed a temperature regulation system. For a space rock flying through sunlight and shadow, this is impossible. For a spacecraft, it is a regularity. And then, the feeling arose that humanity had run into an invisible wall. No matter how much the resolution increased, no matter how much data was collected, the object itself remained one step ahead. It showed precisely as much as it wanted to and hid everything else. This sense of limit was agonizing. For the first time, humanity had the technology to examine an interstellar wanderer so closely, but the clearer the picture became, the stronger the feeling. The answer will not come. Philosophers wrote that the object behaved like a mirror. It reflected our desire to know but did not reveal the secret. Engineers said it resembled an ideal camouflage system, demonstrating signs of technology, then immediately diverting the gaze into a fog of data. Scientists admitted, "We have reached the limit of observation." And yet, this became the most astonishing revelation, because the limit was not in the telescopes or the sensors, but in humanity itself. We could collect millions of gigabytes of data, but could not turn them into understanding. 3I Atlas remained a silent witness, and in this silent game, it taught us the main lesson. The boundaries of knowledge lie not in the cosmos, but within ourselves. The perigee passed, and the object, as if having fulfilled its purpose, began to recede. All the observatories that had lived in continuous observation mode for weeks suddenly felt a void. Data streams continued to come in, but they no longer carried new revelations. It seemed 3I Atlas had allowed humanity a maximum close look at itself, and then immediately retreated. A strange mix of relief and disappointment hung in the atmosphere of the scientific centers. Relief, because nothing catastrophic had occurred. No collision, no radio signal, no contact, which was secretly feared. Disappointment, because everyone had waited for a climax, a moment of truth, and it did not arrive. The object continued to move along its orbit, and its behavior became more predictable. The light variations remained but became fainter. The structural outlines in the images were lost in the noise, as if 3I Atlas was dissolving into space. For some, this was a sign that the show was over. For others, a new turn in the mystery. Perhaps the object deliberately dampened its presence when interest in it reached its peak. The topic quickly faded in the news. Stories about the interstellar wanderer gave way to earthly crises and scandals. But among those who had monitored every change in its trajectory for months, the silence after the storm felt almost painful, as if a sudden, deaf night had fallen after the thunder. Philosophers called this the effect of the gaze. 3. I Atlas reminded humanity that the world is larger than our planet, that there can be presences in the sky beyond our control. But as soon as it began to recede, the temptation arose to forget, to be distracted, and to hide back in everyday life. The silence after the storm turned out to be the most eloquent, because it was in it that the main question sounded: what if we missed the chance? What if the object was truly a messenger, and we failed to hear it? It left as quietly as it came, leaving a trace not in the sky, but in the hearts of those who, for a time, dared to believe that a gaze might be hidden in the silence of the universe. Although 3I Atlas was gradually moving into distant orbits, its presence had already left a mark. Millions of terabytes of data collected by telescopes, satellites, and radio interferometers were now stored in archives. Scientists knew they would be studied for decades. Every pixel of the images, every spectral line, might conceal the key to the solution. But the object's main legacy turned out to be not in the numbers, but in consciousness. People felt for the first time that the cosmos could be not only a stage for the movement of planets and comets, but also a place of rendezvous. Even if the rendezvous remained without words, without confirmation. Already, in the first months after the object's departure, an era of reassessment began. Articles were published comparing the behavior of 3I Atlas with Oumuamua and Borisov. New models were created that allowed for the possibility of artificial structures. Even the most cautious scientists were forced to admit that part of the data did not fit into familiar schemes. Courses dedicated to interstellar anomalies were opened in universities. Young students discussed hypotheses about von Neumann probes, about ancient civilizations, and about the possibility that the galaxy is populated by silent witnesses. Philosophers wrote treatises on the language of silence, on how presence without contact is also a form of communication. In popular culture, the object became a symbol. Its image appeared in films, on book covers, and in music. For some, it was a sign of hope. For others, anxiety. For a third group, a reminder that humanity lives not in a void, but in a cosmos where guests are possible. The trace in memory turned out to be stronger than the object itself. It became a point of reference, like the first steps on the moon or the first radio signals from space. Since then, any mention of interstellar bodies has carried an echo of this encounter. And although 3I Atlas receded, its shadow remained nearby. It lived in the data, in the theories, and in the culture. Humanity did not know what it was, but it knew the main thing: it was. When the noise subsided, when 3I Atlas dissolved into the darkness, only one reflection remained for humanity. It did not leave us a signal, did not show explicit signs of technology, and did not engage in contact, and yet its presence changed our perception. The philosophy of the encounter was not about hearing words, but about experiencing the very fact of the other. Humanity had seen for the first time an object that was too much like a creation, that behaved too intelligently for the chaos of nature. And in this ambiguity, in this balance between rock and probe, a new space for understanding opened up. The world returned to its affairs. States continued to argue, corporations made plans, and people rushed through their daily lives. But somewhere deep down, in everyone who had seen the images or heard the discussions even once, a quiet thought remained. Perhaps we are not alone. Perhaps someone is watching. Perhaps the universe has already entered into a dialogue with us, but in a language we have not yet learned to decipher. For science, this encounter became a reminder. The boundaries of knowledge are not walls, but horizons. They do not limit, they call one to go further. And 3I Atlas became exactly such a horizon. It showed that even in silence, the cosmos speaks. For philosophy, it was a reminder of humility. We are not the center of the universe, but only one link in its endless chain. But there is no humiliation in this. On the contrary, there is hope. If we are noticed, it means we are part of something larger. For humanity as a whole, 3i Atlas became a mirror. Some saw a threat in it, others a promise, and a third group a mystery. But everyone felt that its existence was not accidental, and perhaps that was the message. You are ready to think broader. The philosophy of the encounter was not about solving the riddle, but about realization. Sometimes the most important thing is not the answer, but the very fact of the question posed by the stars. It came and went as quietly as the breath of the universe. 3. I Atlas left no evidence that could be held in the hands, but it left an imprint that cannot be erased. This is what makes it great. Perhaps it was just a rock, an arrival from the interstellar void, perhaps a probe created by the hands of those we do not yet know, or perhaps it was a symbol, a sign that the universe placed near us to remind us that the journey continues. Humanity has always sought signs, in myths, in religions, in science. And one day, a sign appeared in the sky itself. It was silent, but in its silence, everything resonated. Fear and hope, loneliness and belonging, mystery and revelation. And now that it has departed, we are left with this knowledge. We can return to everyday life, we can forget, but in the depths of memory, a shadow will remain that will remind us that once we looked at the sky and the sky looked back. And perhaps that is the most important thing. Not the evidence, not the signals, not the confirmations, but the very possibility of the encounter, an encounter that makes us more than we were. May the stars one day speak louder, but even if they always remain silent, we already know they are watching. And in this knowledge, a new silence is born, a silence from which the future grows.